Mars has fascinated us for millennia. It stands out from all the other planets because of its colour. People call it the red planet, and though in reality it's more like salmon pink, this didn't deter the ancients from associating it with the colour of blood. And from there it was just a short step to believing that Mars was linked with war. Even the classical symbol for Mars, the male symbol, is warlike. It represents an upraised spear, in contrast to the female or Venus symbol, which represents a hand mirror. We no longer link Mars with war, even though in the 30s many people thought that the Martians could genuinely attack us. But our beliefs about the planet are constantly changing, even today. Modern spacecraft have told us that Mars can't support advanced life, yet experts disagree about whether life is even possible there. And even during the past 50 years, our views of the planet have changed dramatically. It was another close approach that made people think that Mars could be the home of advanced life. In 1877, the orbits of Mars and Earth came particularly close, and telescopes had become good enough that astronomers could begin to study the planet. They saw light areas, which they supposed to be continents, and darker areas, which they thought were oceans. Classical names such as Elysium and Arcadia were given to these features. At each pole were glistening white polar caps, just like those of Earth. But the most amazing discovery was made by the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli, who saw long, straight, dark lines crossing continents. These ran for 3,000 or 4,000 miles, each being a standard 60 miles wide. They were immediately termed canals, and that got people thinking. Could they really be genuine canals, cut to bring water from the poles to the dry equatorial regions? The idea wasn't so far-fetched. By the end of the 19th century, astronomers knew that the red colour of Mars was caused by its iron oxide, basically rust. They speculated that Mars's supply of oxygen was tied up in the rocks, and this struck a chord with the environmentalists of the day. Mars was seen as a dying world, having nearly exhausted its precious supplies of water and oxygen. At another close approach in 1894, one astronomer claimed to have seen an unusual flare on the planet. This set H.G. Wells thinking, and the result was War of the Worlds, published in 1898. The flare was the explosion of a giant cannon, firing a desperate mission to conquer the still lush blue-green Earth. Giant machines marched over the familiar and comfortable landscape of the home counties. The Martians were eventually vanquished when they succumbed to nothing more exotic than the common cold, to which they had no natural immunity. And in the popular imagination, Mars became the home of an alien race, little green men from Mars. One astronomer was to become obsessed by the idea of the Martian canals. Percival Lowell founded the observatory in Arizona that still bears his name in order to search for them. But they proved remarkably elusive. Some people saw them, others didn't. Occasionally they appeared double, hinting even more strongly at an artificial origin. And while our knowledge of Mars depended on gazing at the planet through our own unsteady atmosphere, little news could be learned. For the first half of the 20th century, planetary astronomy was in the doldrums, and we only had a sketchy understanding about conditions there. In 1938, this led to a bizarre event. On the 30th of October 1938, as the American people were carving up pumpkins to celebrate Halloween on the following evening, they tuned to the top US radio program, The Charlie McCarthy Show. 10 minutes into the programme, an unspectacular singer came on and millions of people changed station. What many of them heard petrified them. A live radio broadcast was reporting dramatic events in New Jersey, with cylinders landing from the skies and machines unleashing themselves with heat rays onto a defenceless population. The Martians had landed, this time in small-town America rather than England. The docodrama approach of the broadcast, then new to radio, persuaded many people that this was a real invasion. In fact, it was a play produced by then unknown Orson Welles, Within an hour, the radio show had the machines wading in the Hudson River, and the New Yorkers ran into the streets in fear. Mars was living up to its reputation for being a troublesome planet. But was the public view of the red planet as being a possible abode for life, supported by the scientists of the time? Mars, they knew, was a planet about half the size of Earth, farther from the Sun and with traces of carbon dioxide in its atmosphere. It was known to be bitterly cold, with no liquid water or free oxygen. Scientists realized that only the hardiest and most primitive forms of life could exist there. Vegetation of some sort was regarded as being quite probable. Each spring, a wave of darkening was seen spreading outwards from the poles, as melting water apparently invigorated them. What better explanation than the rejuvenation of Martian vegetation as moisture-laden winds spread towards the equator? And Lowell's canals needed an explanation. Might Mars be home to creatures as well as vegetation? And could there still be the remains of a Martian civilization clinging to life on this hostile world? When the Society for Popular Astronomy was formed as the Junior Astronomical Society in 1953, the jury was still out on the question of life on Mars. In the second issue of the Society magazine, then called The Junior Astronomer, Patrick Moore wrote these words: "The Martians may have mastered the techniques of artificial photosynthesis, thus enabling them to manufacture oxygen out of the plentiful carbon dioxide in their atmosphere, or they may be extracting it from the ferric oxide or iron rust that gives Mars its red colour." Patrick even wrote a science fiction novel, Peril on Mars, in which Martian explorers stumbled on life forms that quickly developed as soon as Earthlings started to add oxygen to the atmosphere.
The sight facing him was something which he had never pictured in his worst dreams. He was looking into a nest of bugs. The shallow pit beyond the stems was bare of plants, and seemed to be filled with insects very like the one he had killed, but much larger. Some of them were 3 or 4 feet long, and all had the same lizard-like heads, red glinting eyes, and sharp teeth. Their bodies were striped with black and grey, and they had short veined wings, which whirred like fans as they hovered over the lair.
Science fiction indeed, but based on the knowledge of the time. And if that sounds out on a limb, here's a passage from The Sands of Mars, written by Arthur C. Clarke in 1951, which tells of the first contact between Earthlings and Martians.
There were 10 of the creatures in the glade, and they were all too busy to take any notice of the intruders. In appearance they resembled very plump kangaroos, their almost spherical bodies balanced on 2 large, slender hind limbs. They were hairless, and their skin had a curious waxy sheen, like polished leather. 2 thin forearms, which seemed to be completely flexible, sprouted from the upper part of the body, and ended in tiny hands like the claws of a bird. A pair of large, almost transparent ears hung limply from the head, twitching occasionally, and sometimes folding themselves into trumpets, which looked as if they might be extremely efficient sound detectors, even in this thin atmosphere.
That was the situation at the start of the space age. Maybe it was optimism, but many scientists agreed that vegetation on Mars was a probability rather than just a possibility. And the more adventurous hoped that there might be more advanced life against the odds. After all, the air pressure on Mars was similar to that on Earth at a height of around 53,000 feet, unbreathable by humans, but perhaps thick enough for creatures that had evolved to allow for it. Nitrogen was regarded as a likely constituent as in Earth's atmosphere, with the carbon dioxide that had been detected making up just a minor part. Then along came reality, in the shape of the first close-up pictures of the planet taken in 1965 by the American probe Mariner 4. This map, issued to show the track of the craft over the surface, reveals that NASA was still using maps that showed numerous canals. Mariner 4's primitive TV cameras took just 22 pictures of what we would now call poor quality, taking a narrow strip of the surface. They revealed a cratered terrain, and the probe's radio signals showed that the atmosphere was much thinner than had been thought, less than 1% than at Earth's surface. And worse, there was no trace of nitrogen, but just carbon dioxide, the main component of a tenuous atmosphere, rather than just a small part of a thicker one. Such an atmosphere would be quite incapable of shielding life forms from the deadly ultraviolet radiation from the sun. At a stroke, Mars was rendered completely sterile. The textbooks all had to be rewritten. Until then, the only body that had been photographed in close-up was the Moon. One or two people had suggested that Mars ought to be cratered like the Moon, but somehow the old idea that Mars was a sort of failed Earth held sway. Those optimistic scenarios with vegetation and maybe animal life were now out of the question. Mariner 4 was followed in 1969 by a pair of probes, Mariner 6 and 7, that skimmed past the planet and took more than 200 photos as they went. The pictures, though better quality than Mariner 4's, showed yet more craters. It looked as if Mars had always been a geologically dead world, battered like the Moon by cosmic debris since its formation. But we had still seen only a small portion of the planet in any detail. In 1971, our fourth Mariner probe, Mariner 9, went into orbit about the planet. To the alarm of the team scientists, the first picture showed a globe almost completely devoid of any features. Fortunately, Earth-based astronomers were watching and were able to tell them that a major dust storm was in progress, filling almost the entire atmosphere with fine dust that obscured virtually all the fine details from view. Slowly, the dust began to settle. To the amazement of the scientists, the first feature to appear was the summit of a huge volcano, a feature that 19th century astronomers had fancifully called Nix Olympica, the Olympic snow. This turned out to be the largest volcano in the whole solar system. 500 kilometers across and 27 kilometers high, it was promptly named Olympus Mons, Mount Olympus. In fact, many Martian features have been given new names based on the old ones, but with new descriptions as their true nature has become known. But as well as the volcanoes, which show that Mars has not been as dead as supposed, Mariner 9's 8,000 photos reveal the most significant features of all, the channels and the chasms. Even though 3 spacecraft have flown past the planet, no hint of these had been seen before, and our view of Mars changed yet again. This is the most spectacular of the chasms, Valles Marineris, or Mariner Valleys, named after the spacecraft that discovered it. Though it might look like the Grand Canyon on Earth, this one is 3,000 kilometers long and 8 kilometers deep, and the Grand Canyon will be little more than one of its tributaries if it was placed on Mars. Actually, the entire Alps would fit inside Valles Marineris. It's a great rift in the surface, created at the same time as the fastest ridge to the west, lined with these 3 great volcanoes that would have spewed out not just lava, but huge quantities of gas. Follow Valles Marineris to the east, and it opens up into an estuary with plentiful evidence that at one time the surface was washed over by floods. This map, which shows high ground as red and low ground as blue, shows this very graphically. Gone was the idea of Mars as a drab, dead world that had simply been pitted over the ages, with craters and asteroids crashing into the surface. Instead, there were clear signs that at some stage things had been a lot more lively, physically, if not biologically. Now we had a Mars that at one time had been warmer and wetter, so much so that it even had had floods. And there were signs, too, that there might even be ice beneath the surface. Unlike the clean, sharp appearance of the lunar impact craters, on Mars the impacts were much more messy. Surrounding some of them is a region which appears to have been melted and subsequently frozen. People speculated that water vapour had once billowed from the volcanoes and had then condensed and flowed across the surface during a warm period when Mars would have had a thicker atmosphere than today. But eventually it lost most of its atmosphere, the climate becoming colder, and the water froze to permafrost beneath the surface. And if there had been once water and a denser atmosphere, could there have been life? Could there still be life today, if not in the surface, but then below? The Mariner 9 pictures also banish forever some old ideas about Mars. Though Schiaparelli and others had claimed to see channels almost a century before Mariner, these can have been nothing more than optical illusions as observers strained to make sense of a jumble of detail through Earth's shimmering atmosphere. The channels revealed by Mariner don't tie up with the old canals, and the idea that the dark areas were vegetation that flourished and died with the seasons also bit the dust, quite literally, because they're simply darker areas of rock that are covered and uncovered by dust. The stage was now set for an even more ambitious assault on Mars. 2 spacecraft called Viking 1 and 2, each consisting of an orbiter with cameras and instruments and a lander that would touch down and study the surface. As well as cameras, the landers would have instruments that would analyze the rocks and try to detect traces of life on the surface. Viking 1 touched down on Mars in the summer of 1976. The first pictures to be released showed a bleak landscape of reddish rocks. Unlike the Moon, which has no atmosphere and therefore a totally black sky and stark shadows, the thin Martian air does give a more Earth-like look to the landscape. Gone now were the landscapes of science fiction in which small creatures scuttled amongst the simple plants. Instead, the reality of Mars was a barren desert in which the only changes from hour to hour were the shifting shadows. In the distance were sand dunes, and occasionally the skies would show thin clouds. In the mornings there might be a coating of white frost in the shadows, which disappeared in the pale sunlight. But the most important news came from the experiments on board the landers. A small scoop picked up soil samples and dumped them into incubators with moisture, nutrients, bright lights, and warmth. If there was any life present, it should flourish and give off gas. And that's what happened. But was it due to life? Instead of providing a definitive answer, the Viking experiments have continued to attract controversy over the years. NASA's line is that the production of gas was merely a chemical reaction, and they insist that their prime experiment found no carbon in the Martian soil. No carbon means no living cells, so Mars must be dead. But times move on, and experts now think that the carbon detection experiment wasn't actually very sensitive. So the only verdict we can give on the Viking search for life is not proven. While the landers grubbed in the red soil, high overhead the Viking orbiters harvested thousands of images that gave a much clearer picture of the entire Martian surface. They showed a profusion of watercourses, deep depressions filled with dust, a dune field near the North Pole, larger than the Sahara, ice cliffs and layers of soil at the polar caps that hinted of previous ice ages, and curious features that have no counterpart on Earth. Some of these prompted wild claims for Martian civilizations that still linger on in numerous websites. Take this area, for example, part of the Cydonia region of Mars. It's been nicknamed the Inca City for its resemblance to ruined buildings and walls. But when you realize that each supposed building is several miles across, the chance that they were the work of intelligent beings goes down. In fact, geologists explain these formations as fractures from a giant impact site underlying the terrain. Not far away lies the most infamous Martian feature of all, the so-called face on Mars. When the scientists at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, who control the Viking craft, released this picture, they pointed out it was nothing more than a natural feature a kilometre or so long. The black dots across the picture are simply data dropouts, and they happen to enhance the appearance of the face. But over the years, this image has gained in notoriety, and people began to claim it was a genuine sculpture by a previous, or possibly even still remaining, Martian culture. The theory that Mars harbours some sort of mysterious, intelligent life was bolstered over the years by the failure of various spacecraft to reach the planet. Between 1971 and 1974, no fewer than 6 Soviet Mars probes had all reached Mars, then failed in some way after reaching the planet. One of them actually made it to the planet's surface, but stopped transmitting after 2 minutes. Following the successful Viking probes of 1976, one of which kept working for 3.5 years, scientists seemed to lose interest in the planet. Not until 1988 was another probe sent, this time by the Soviets again. Designed to study both Mars and the larger of Mars's 2 moons, Phobos, the probe was accidentally turned off by a ground controller. Its sister ship, Phobos 2, was more lucky and reached the planet. It began its mapping mission, but it too stopped transmitting after 2 months in orbit. As we've seen, this was not unusual for a Soviet Mars probe, but its last image reportedly showed a mysterious, cigar-shaped object silhouetted against the Martian surface. To some, this supported the belief that Mars is still the source of an alien intelligence. If not original Martians, then maybe it's harbouring aliens from beyond the solar system. Even the 2 Martian satellites themselves have caused endless speculation. Unlike Earth's moon, which plods sedately around the Earth in 29 days, Phobos and Deimos dash around Mars in just 8 hours and 28 hours respectively. Probably they're just asteroids, chunks of debris that never managed to form a planet, that strayed too close to Mars and were captured by its gravitational field. But mystery has surrounded them ever since they were discovered in 1877. First, people wondered why even these tiny and faint moons had not been spotted previously, though in fact they're as difficult to observe because of their rapid movement and because their light is drowned out by the glare of Mars itself. So the suggestion was made that they might be artificial moons launched by the Martians. Further curiosities then emerged. It turned out that the great astronomer Kepler, who first laid down the laws of planetary motion, had predicted as long ago as 1610 that Mars would have 2 moons. Then the English writer Jonathan Swift wrote in 1726 that the Laputians in Gulliver's Travels knew that Mars had 2 moons, and even fairly accurately quoted their orbits around Mars. How could Kepler and Swift have known all this? The telescopes of their time couldn't possibly have shown the moons. Actually, Kepler's prediction method was simple. Venus has no moon, Earth has 1, and Jupiter was known to have 4 at the time, so Mars probably has 2. Swift would have used this prediction in his writing and just made a lucky guess about the orbits. But the speculation didn't end there. In the 1960s, Russian astronomer Joseph Shklovsky also suggested that Phobos is an artificial moon, basing his conclusions on the nature of its orbit. He claimed it was probably hollow and may have been built by an earlier Martian civilization. Some high-ranking US officials backed up Shklovsky, and even well-known American astronomer Carl Sagan didn't rule out the notion. President Eisenhower himself is reported to have believed that Phobos is an artificial moon. So the mysterious cigar-shaped object seen by the Russian Phobos craft was regarded as just another proof that something strange is happening around Mars. But the truth is much less exciting. What it photographed was nothing more than the shadow of Phobos projected on the Martian surface, an effect seen many times since by many recent Martian probes. But the rumours didn't end with the Phobos craft. The curse of Mars struck again in 1993 when the American Mars Observer craft got within 3 days of the planet and then disappeared when a braking manoeuvre went wrong. Was it a NASA blunder, or a more sinister blow by the Martians against the Earth invasion? However, in the meantime, other work was going on here on Earth that caused scientists to wonder if they had written off Martian life too soon. In Australia, the oldest fossils ever seen, the remains of microscopic algae, were dated at 3.5 billion years, a time when Mars and Earth would have been geologically similar. Then an even older carbon grain, found in rocks in Greenland, turned out to contain the right ratio of the isotopes carbon-12 and carbon-13 to show that life might have been present on Earth 3.9 billion years ago, just 700 million years after the Earth's formation. This might be a long time on our present time scale, but geologically it was when the Earth had scarcely cooled down from its formation. Other scientists, working in widely different environments, reported that life on Earth is astonishingly robust. Deep in the ocean, where no light penetrates, are black smokers, places where the innards of the Earth pour out. They're at the same temperatures generally used to sterilize water, yet there are whole communities of sea creatures surrounding them. In the geysers of volcanic regions, the conditions are so strongly acid that any animal straying into them would be killed, yet they have thriving colonies of algae. And Even more significantly, algae were found living inside rocks from frozen Antarctica, in locations as close to Martian conditions as it's possible to find on Earth. A name was made up for these wide-ranging and persistent forms of life: extremophiles. Suddenly, the Martian environment wasn't looking so hostile after all. If these forms of life could persist in extreme environments on the Earth, why not on Mars? But the life wouldn't be on the surface, but under it, maybe buried in rocks. Then, in August 1996, a bombshell exploded whose echoes are still being heard. American scientists announced that they had discovered what appeared to be fossils in a rock that had come directly from Mars. The rock in question was a meteorite, codename ALH 84001, that had been picked up in Antarctica back in 1984. Antarctica is a great site for finding meteorites because there's virtually no rainfall to erode them, as happens elsewhere on Earth, and ice fields are where they stand out very obviously. This particular meteorite had properties that set it aside from most of the others. Its chemical composition was unusual and matched a small and elite group of meteorites that contained pockets of air with the same composition as the Viking probes had measured on Mars. ALH 84001 was undoubtedly a piece of Mars, blasted out from the planet by an asteroid impact 16 million years ago, and had eventually fallen to Earth. So this made the structures inside it even more amazing. They strongly resemble microbacteria, and if they had been found on an Earth rock, there would probably have been little argument about the suggestion. To add to the evidence, they contain mineral features that are widely accepted as evidence of a biological origin. But most scientists prefer to be cautious about the claims, and even now the arguments rumble on. Experts disagree as to whether these tiny features are really evidence for fossil life on Mars, but the claims certainly haven't been overturned. When the announcement was made in 1996, NASA's chiefs hailed the discovery as strong evidence that there is still life on Mars. President Clinton went so far as to call it one of the most stunning insights into our universe that science has ever uncovered. And as a booster for NASA funding, it was perfect. Mars was to be the target for a flotilla of spacecraft, both American and Russian, that would solve the question of life on Mars once and for all. That put the spotlight squarely on a mission about to be launched, the huge Russian-European probe Mars 96. But while it was still in Earth orbit, the failure of one of its motors resulted in the loss of the mission when it crashed back to Earth. Then, in 1997, finally a spacecraft got through, Mars Pathfinder. This tiny lander grabbed the world's attention when it parachuted onto the surface of Mars, protected by huge airbags, so it bounced several times before coming to rest. Then the airbags deflated, allowing the craft to release a pushchair-sized rover craft onto the surface. The rover, named Sojourner, was able to crawl around at the landing site, investigating the rocks in detail. It even carried instruments for analysing their composition. And the lander itself carried not just cameras but instruments to measure the conditions on Mars. In nearly 6 months of operation, it took photos suggesting that nearby hills, nicknamed the Twin Peaks, had been subject in the past to flows of water. While Sojourner was trundling around the surface, another NASA spacecraft quietly slipped into orbit high overhead. This was the Mars Global Surveyor, or MGS, equipped with a braking motor made in deepest Buckinghamshire. Among its early targets, NASA chose the notorious Face on Mars. The new photos showed nothing more than a low hill, with no obvious resemblance to a face. NASA said that's what it had been all along, while the skeptics said that either the photos had been doctored or the face had been changed. But MGS added fuel to the controversy over life on Mars, altering our views yet again. Its detailed photos showed persuasive evidence of water gullies and springs, adding to the suspicions that water might be present below the surface. The detailed pictures from the MGS also showed plenty of evidence for layered rocks, like sedimentary rocks on Earth, further evidence for watery periods in Mars's past. And fresh lava flows on the flanks of Olympus Mons suggest that the giant volcano is not dead, but merely slumbering. But examining the surface isn't all that's needed. Scientists need as much information as possible about Mars's global environment, and a spacecraft called Mars Climate Orbiter was meant to orbit the planet, returning data on its atmosphere and its weather systems. In 1999, the craft reached Mars and should have slowed down in order to go into orbit. But while it was behind Mars as seen from Earth, something happened to the probe and it was never heard from again. Technicians decided that the craft had crash-landed on the planet. An investigation showed that while one group of the construction team were using imperial units of measurements, inches and pounds, another group was using metric measures, centimetres and grams. Within weeks, Mars' polar lander arrived and was due to land near the polar regions, an area where there is still water ice, increasing the chances of finding life. But in one of the most embarrassing failures ever to be experienced by the American space program, this craft also disappeared from view. This time, the spacecraft had faulty sensors on board, which shut off its re-entry rockets while it was still high above the Martian surface. But since then, another Mars probe has been fantastically successful. Mars Odyssey made the headlines when its instruments revealed signs that vast reserves of water ice still lie just below the surface of the planet. It did this from orbit by detecting the particles dislodged from the surface by cosmic rays, highly energetic space particles. These revealed abundant hydrogen atoms, most probably resulting from water ice within a metre or so of the surface. Areas on the map coloured dark blue show where the ice is most strongly concentrated, near the poles. Although when this map was made in May 2002, it appeared there was more ice in the southern hemisphere, scientists put this down to a layer of carbon dioxide ice in the northern hemisphere, masking the signal from the hydrogen below the surface. Since then, northern hemisphere summer on Mars has melted the carbon dioxide ice, allowing the investigator to see that there's just as much water ice in the northern hemisphere, if not more. What do these findings mean for the chances of Martian life? Right now, the feeling is somewhere on Mars there's a good chance of finding some sort of life. It might not be a very dramatic form of life, but if we do find it, it will speak very plainly to us about the way life formed both on Mars and the Earth. In fact, there are even people who suggest that life might have formed first on Mars and been transferred to Earth in the distant past by meteorites such as ALH 84001. In that case, we are all really Martians. So what is this world like that we might even consider home? If you could suddenly be transported there, a glance out of the window would reveal a place that could be mistaken for a barren landscape on Earth, with some disturbing differences. You might notice that the sunlight is a little dimmer, because Mars is about half as far away again from the sun as we are. But the sky is bright, as on Earth, rather than black, as on the airless moon. Otherwise, the scene is not different from a rocky landscape on Earth, though it's rare on Earth to find a place with no sign of vegetation or life of any kind. You would feel strangely light in your seat, though, and your limbs would also feel light, because the pull of gravity on Mars is only a third of that on Earth. Moving around would feel odd at first, because you'd need less energy, and your paces would be much longer. As you view this world, some things will be familiar. The shadows would move just as they do on Earth, because a day on Mars is only 37 minutes longer than one of ours. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, just as on Earth. From time to time, cirrus clouds appear in the sky. But try to venture outside, and you would soon be in trouble. The air is not only bitterly cold, but it's also so thin as to be unbreathable, so you would need a breathing mask and a heated pressure suit. You could remove a glove for a few seconds to pick up a rock, but the tingling would tell you instantly that all was not well. Your blood would begin to boil, and the ultraviolet radiation from the sun would scorch your skin in seconds. Mars is no place for sunbathing. But assuming you're well protected against the conditions, you could start to explore the planet. In the future, and it's anybody's guess when, people will undoubtedly start to explore the planet that for the time being we can only view from a distance. The great canyons, such as the Valles Marineris, will certainly be on the picture postcards of the future. But being on such a large scale, they may not look as spectacular from ground level as they do from space. Nor will the great volcanoes, such as Olympus Mons, tower over you. They spread over such a large area that you would see little more than rising ground. On Mars, which is a smaller planet than Earth, the horizon is considerably closer. The winds are mostly quite light. As well as having a day length similar to ours, Mars's axis is tilted just like Earth's, so there are seasons as well. But Mars's year is about twice as long as our own. So, though summer lasts twice as long, so does the bitter winter. On a balmy summer's day at the equator, the sand may just become warm to the touch. Though just a foot or two off the ground, the air temperature is below freezing. Nevertheless, the local heating can easily cause whirlwinds, and huge dust devils are a regular feature of the long Martian summer. They're even visible from space. Some areas are crisscrossed with the trails left by these tornadoes. Occasionally, at the height of summer, a major dust storm can blow up, like the one seen by Mariner 9. For explorers, not only will it sandblast your spacecraft, but the fine dust will find its way everywhere you open the hatch for so much of a fraction of a second. So what's the future for Mars exploration? During the next decade, NASA hopes to pull off an audacious sample return mission that will bring precious pieces of Mars back to Earth. And looking farther ahead, people are talking seriously about a human Mars mission. Meanwhile, Mars beckons us as never before. This year's close approach will allow more people than ever to see it in close-up for themselves. So as you gaze at its red plains, imagine what it would be like to walk there for yourself. And one thing is certain. When we do actually reach the red planet, there'll be more surprises awaiting us. We have been wrong about Mars too many times in the past to think that by now we know it all.